Thank you, Governor. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you guys today. I know that we are late into activities, and lots of people who are smarter and more intelligible than I am have already spoken at you at length. So I will endeavor to try not to be too unduly tedious. What I want to talk with you guys about today is some of the ideas come out of my new book, Cage Busting Leadership. I'm happy to talk about other stuff. Was trapped in Savannah last night due to airline excitement after AASA, so I only heard secondary accounts. But it sounds like, as usual, a lot of Common Core has been on the mind. Certainly happy to offer a couple of thoughts on that score. Cage Busting Leadership, really pretty simple. Those of you who know me, I work at a think tank in D.C., a place called AEI. Working in a think tank means you don't actually do very much of anything. Some people regard that as a limitation. If you're glass is half full kind of person, you regard it as an opportunity to travel a lot, to visit with folks, to see what's going on around the country. One of the things that has struck me over the years in doing this work is that it is absolutely true the degree to which rules, regulations, contracts, culture constrict and make it harder to lead great schools and systems. I have also become convinced, however, that leaders in schools and systems can do much more than they think they can do, than they know they can do, or than they do. And this is because they live in a world of urban myth, they live in a world of self-imposed constraints, they live in a world of fear and ambiguity, and we as advocates or as policymakers or as state leaders are going to inevitably be disappointed by the reform agenda if we don't take account of the fact that leaders are running into these self-imposed barriers when trying to act on the improvement agenda. This is a book that helps leaders think about how they do this, and that is intended to help folks like you understand how to put leaders in a position where they're more likely to succeed. For me, the patron saint of a half-century of school reform is Sisyphus. Educated room, you guys know Sisyphus. Greek king, had a nasty habit of murdering travelers and thieves. Excuse me, not thieves so much, travelers and dignitaries. There's a difference, I hear. When he died, the gods weren't amused. They condemned him to Hades. His eternal torment was to try to roll a boulder up a mountain. Every time he got halfway up, it would roll back down. For those of you who've been doing education reform for more than a couple years, this sounds frighteningly familiar. You may flash on Ron Edmonds' effective schools research in the 1970s, where the U.S. government spent millions of bucks to have Edmonds try to identify the characteristics of effective schools. Ron, an incredibly smart guy, did a terrific job, figured out this rocket science stuff. They had strong leadership. They used formative assessment. They had strong professional cultures. You know, shocking stuff. We now had the recipe for great schools. We tried to go to scale with the effective schools recipe, and by 1985, you could read a whole bunch of articles about the problems of getting to scale with effective schools research. So in the 1980s, we tried new strategies. There were great promising pilot results on site-based management and block scheduling. People were excited that we had finally found the formula. They were halfway up the mountain. They started to take those ideas to scale, and the results were disappointing. In the 1990s, we tried comprehensive school reform in small high schools. Comprehensive school reform showed remarkable promise. It was written into NCLB. Problem was, the evaluation by WestEd 16 years after turned out that schools which had been doing comprehensive school reform made less progress than schools that didn't do anything at all. Whoops. In this decade, we have a whole bunch of new recipes and opportunities. When these things don't work, we tend to be like the guy's poor wife at the bottom of that mountain. When block scheduling or effective schools or comprehensive school reform doesn't pay off at scale, we say, well, it was a good idea, but we must have goofed up on the implementation. So what we do is we offer useful advice on how to roll that boulder. We say, if we were that guy's poor wife, we'd say, spread your hands a little bit wider, honey. That must be the problem. Your hands are too narrow. Or I told you not to try to roll the boulder up a mountain in those sandals. Put on hiking gear. problem is those things don't actually address the fundamental problem, which is that the guy's trying to roll a boulder up a mountain. If he weren't on the incline, he'd probably be in better shape. Well, in education, we don't yell, hold your hands wider. Instead, we have our own whole set of yelled advice from the sidelines. We tell people they should use best practices. They should use data-driven decision-making. They should be collaborative. I got to tell you what, if you go back and talk to folks who did comprehensive school reform and block scheduling and site-based management, they were not trying to use worst practices. It's not like they goofed up because they hadn't heard of best practices, and now we have the recipe. They were using best practices, but it turns out it didn't pay off. Comprehensive school reform looks remarkably like what we now call school turnarounds, except that the people pushing school turnarounds figure that they have now changed the label so they get a fresh start. It's not that these ideas are bad ideas. Just about everything up here I think is good for kids. I used to teach with Carol Tomlinson at UVA, big fan of differentiated instruction. The point is not that these are not good for kids, but that they amount to nothing more than boulder rolling strategies unless you tackle that incline. At which point you say, all right, well, fine, interesting metaphor, what the hell are you talking about? Real simple example. Michelle Rhee is, as many of us know Michelle, is in some ways a polarizing personality. One of the less polarizing things she wanted to do when she went to Washington as chancellor was she had the crazy idea that in a turnaround school, parents could be more helpful and supportive if they knew whether the kids were showing up each day. Michelle's a big thinker. When she became chancellor, it took 8 business days for DCPS to be able to tell a parent if their child had showed up at school each day. If you think it's instantaneous in the districts in your state, I advise you to actually poke into this before you assert that. It took 8 business days. It took 8 business days because teachers took attendance by putting a sticky on the Scantron, hanging it in one of those folders on the door. Somebody eventually came around from the office, collected them, put them in a wire basket. Somebody had to drive around to 121 schools, collect all those things out of the wire baskets. They had to get sorted through mail, put in the right wire basket in Central, sat around till somebody coded it, fax, blah, 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 over the firewalls 8 days later. They were trying to do turnarounds in middle schools. And they thought parents could be more helpful if they knew if the kids showed up at school and they left the house each day. So Michelle got her team together, and one of her young outside-the-box thinkers had heard of a new technical device that could help teachers take attendance more rapidly. It's called the laptop. And they said, hey, at the 3 middle schools where we're doing this pilot turnaround initiative, why don't we let teachers take attendance on laptop? We'll get it cleared over the firewall same day. Parents can either check on a device if they have it or go to the library and find out if their child went to school when they left home. Sat down with their negotiating partners at the Washington Teachers Union. The general counsel for the WTU said, obviously, taking attendance is a permissible work duty, no problem. Here's the headache. Having teachers take attendance on a laptop constitutes data entry, and data entry is a prohibited work duty. Took them 12 weeks. Kaya Henderson, who's now chancellor, was then deputy chancellor, eventually got an MOU for 3 schools to be able to let teachers take attendance on laptops. The moral of this story is not that unions are bad guys. That is the exact, that's an interesting red herring. In this particular case, I will bet you dollars to donuts that there was some knucklehead principal in DCPS in 1993 or 1983 who didn't like a teacher on their staff. And they made that teacher do a whole ton of data entry just to mess with them. And the union grieved it, and the next time they negotiated, they wrote it into the contract because that's what unions do. And there's one little tiny provision written in because there was one chucklehead principal 30 years before in DCPS, became a permanent barrier that never went away. That is the world of school and system leaders that I see each and every day. Leaders spend enormous amounts of time and energy not making good decisions for kids, not solving problems, but figuring out how can they possibly reprogram a few bucks, move a teacher, or get permission to do something that they already think is right for kids. They spend 30 or 40% of their time on this. And then they try to drive school improvement with the remaining 60%. There's your mountain. They're climbing at a 40% incline. If they work a 80-hour week, they only get 48 hours of actual work because they're burning the rest just dealing with yesterday's detritus. Now the problem is, I don't actually like the mountain metaphor. Problem with the mountain metaphor is that mountains are natural phenomena. They're just there. Nothing we can do about it. What I've described to you is not natural. It is a man-made phenomenon. It is the consequence of decade upon decade of contract writing and rulemaking and regulation around federal grant programs and all kinds of perfectly well-intentioned efforts to do better. In fact, I'll go you one better. It's not unique to education. The way we create these cages, the rules, the barriers, this happens in every organization. Every successful organization that lives long enough winds up with this exact same problem. Yesterday's rules and practices and norms become barnacles that cling to the hull. How do we deal with it in the private sector? Funny trick here. Average lifespan of a Fortune 500 company, 50 years, birth to dissolution. 3/4 of America's 25 biggest companies did not exist in 1965. So what happens in the private sector is it's not that Pan Am and TWA and Bethlehem Steel figure out how to reimagine themselves with new technology or a changed labor force or how to meet new expectations. What happens is the old guys go away and somebody else gets to start on a fresh sheet of paper. Problem is, we generally don't get to do that in education. What we're doing is we're asking school and system leaders to go into yesterday's institutions and make them much better. Now, this actually creates a really interesting problem. If we just wanted school and system leaders to go out to Silicon Valley and start from scratch, all they would need to know about is learning. Teaching, learning, students, curriculum, instruction, pedagogy, they'd be good to go. But we want them to come in to these aged organizations and bend to the bars of that cage. And we're not preparing leaders to do it. So when we say that leaders don't know what to do, when we say that leaders are unimaginative, when we say we need better leaders, we're actually being unfair. We're speaking out of turn. We have never selected, trained, cultivated, or motivated leaders to do what we're now asking them to do. Hardly surprised that they don't do it. Everything you see in educational leadership today is about what we call instructional leadership. What Dick Elmore famously talked about is student and teacher in the presence of curriculum. We're all on the same page. That is what schools are for. Schools are in the business of teaching and learning. But if you want to go into an outdated, anachronistic organization and do that work well, with 100% of your energy in your mind, you need another skill set, a complementary skill set, the cage-busting skill set, which we're going to talk about for a bit. But let me just make this point starkly to you, because you guys deal with ed leadership programs. There's more than 500 just in the U.S. Department of Ed database. There's about 800 in all. These are the places that train our EDDs and our MEDs who become principals and superintendents and CTOs and CIOs and the rest. When they read magazines for advice, for instance, the two most widely read magazines by educational leaders are Educational Leadership and Phi Delta Kappan. This looks at what got written about in those magazines from 2009 to 2012. If you are looking for advice on instructional leadership, how to get people to like each other, to be nice, to be enthusiastic, you can go to town. Collaboration, professional development, culture. You could find hundreds and hundreds of mentions. But if during the Great Recession, you're looking for advice on how do you handle layoffs smart, on how do you approach negotiation, on how do you deal with regulatory issues, you're essentially left to your own devices. This is not atypical. If you look at the most widely read books that your institutions use when training principals and system leaders, these are books on the principalship in particular, about a dozen of the most widely assigned books. Each of these books talks at length about personnel management, evaluation, supervision. But if you look in these books, you will never find a single solitary mention in any of them of union contract or collective bargaining. So we are teaching leaders, how do you evaluate, how do you dismiss, how do you supervise without ever once mentioning the real world in which this stuff happens. You can do the same thing almost in all of these texts with words like Title I or Title III. They never mention the real world in which leaders operate. And then we're surprised leaders don't know what they're supposed to do. Let me put it this way. I teach at the University of Pennsylvania Graduate School of Education, and I teach at the Rice University Jones School of Business, where we've got the Texas has approved Jones to train school and system leaders. At Jones, people who want to be school and system leaders in charters or in district schools in the Houston area sit side by side with people who want to run hospitals in MBA classes. They sit side by side with people who want to run nonprofits, with people who want to be sleazy energy traders. And they're taught by faculty who teach people who want to be executives in a whole bunch of fields, who've got expertise in the private and public sector, who give them readings from a broad array of fields. And what they get is diverse experience. They learn how UPS and FedEx manage logistics, how Harris manages personnel, how Google and 3Com think about employee morale. If you go to ed leadership programs, we bubble wrap our people. We take people who are career K-12 educators. We only sit them next to other career K-12 educators. They are only taught by people who themselves are ed leadership professors. All they read is the ed leadership canon, Sir Giovanni and Bowman and Deal and Leithwood and Elmore and Fulton and Hargraves. And these are good and smart people, and they've got a lot of good and important stuff to say. But we have systematically denied our leaders any of the skills that could actually help them put the school improvement agenda to work. And this is particularly troubling because these guys don't have any work experience outside K-12. Over 90% of principals have never worked outside of K-12. 50% of superintendents were school administrators before the age of 30. 80% of school superintendents' career was classroom teacher, school principal, central office, superintendent. Nowhere in this chain are we giving these people the skill set to think differently about the challenges they face. And actually, it goes one worse than that. Not only are they denied any of the cage-busting skills, but when they read the instructional leadership book, they are told that cage-busting is bad, that it's for bullies, that it's destructive. Michael Fullen and Andy Hargraves, who are terrific, smart, thoughtful guys, for instance, in What's Worth Waiting For in Your School, tell leaders that they are moral failures if they fire somebody who stinks. I got to tell you what, you guys all know the 20-80 rule. 20% of folks in any organization do about 80% of the work. What is often forgotten in education is the 80-20 rule. Leaders in any organization spend about 80% of their energy on the worst performing 20% of employees. So if you look at turnaround schools with 50 faculty, you will see 5 or 8 faculty who just don't have the will or the skill to make it happen. And those are the people who your principals and APs are spending all their time with. They're cleaning up after the elephant. They're evaluating. They're counseling. And you've got 40 teachers in that building who are open to advice, who are hungry for mentoring, but there's no time left because we're too busy climbing the hill. That cage is the regulations and practices and cultures that make us accept mediocrity as the norm. So what do you do to change this? Well, real simple point. School and system leaders, the people that you guys are counting on to drive improvement, only have 4 tools at their disposal. That's it. They have tools, talent, time, and money. They have nothing else. And the more they use these cavalierly or ineffectually, the more we have to rely on the magic of boulder rolling techniques. Let me give you a couple of quick examples. Average school in this country has got kids for about 180 days a year, 6 hours a day of instruction, 1,080 instructional hours. Many of you have had educators come to you, tell them they need to extend learning time, and they want you to either pony up money for ELT programs, or they want you to fund 2 extra weeks of school, 10 extra days, 6 hours a day. That'll take them from 1,080 hours up by 60 to 1,140. All right. Interesting place to start, though, is University of Michigan time use studies have long taught us that the average school only uses about 65, maybe 70% of their instructional time for instruction. What's the rest used for? Attendance, assemblies, announcements, paper passing, discipline. 1,080 hours, 30 to 35% wasted. They are wasting on average 360 hours a year at each of your schools. That sends a message to kids that we don't value their time. It wastes the time of effective educators. And they then want you, school and system leaders, want you to pony up more money to buy them extra time because they can't bother to clean up what's on their plate. If folks increase the efficacy of their use of time by a third, that is 120 instructional hours. That's like you funding an extra 4 to 6 weeks of school. Well, what do I have in mind? One quick example. Doug Lemov, many of you might be familiar with Doug's terrific book, Teach Like a Champion, talks about a number of practices used by effective teachers. One Doug talks about is called tight transitions. If you go and look at it, observe a typical K-5 classroom, you will apparently see that the average teacher passes out about 15 pieces of paper a day. If you stopwatch it, the average class is off task for about 1.5 minutes to 2 minutes each time this happens. One of the things Doug noticed in studying effective teachers is that they turn the first day of school into soccer practice when it comes to paper passing. They take a half hour and they say, kids, we're going to keep passing until we're front to back and ready to go in 12 or 15 seconds. Do the math. 1.5 minutes reclaimed, 15 times a day. That's 2 hours a week, 36 weeks a year. That's 70 hours a year. Tell you what, if your teachers in K-5 are that much more efficient about paper passing, they have just added 2 weeks to the academic year without you spending another nickel. Yet, when you go into school systems and you sit down with the deputy superintendent for instruction and you talk about what are they doing to make sure principals are supporting teachers on efficient time use and monitoring and holding their feet to the fire, districts across this country haven't even thought about this. So you can put all the pressure you want on systems to do the right thing or to ask them to implement Common Core, but if we have school and system leadership that is being casual about time, we're setting them up to have to go with that big incline. Another example. Everybody needs more money. We always need more money. Average teacher in this country is absent 8 days a year. First off, we know that that is more or less time learning stops. So that's another 48 hours of non-learning. If you can find ways to get teachers to show up more often, it is like, if they show up 50% more often, it's like you've added a week to the academic year, for starters. But the average district also spends $125 per substitute teacher. So 8 times 125, average district is spending another $1,000 a year per full-time equivalent teacher just to have a warm body show up when that teacher's absent. Well, what are you guys doing? What are your school systems doing to acknowledge and recognize and celebrate those schools where everybody is showing up every day? What kind of awards are there? What kind of savings sharing is there with faculty who are doing the right thing? Are there schools getting bonuses from the money they're saving taxpayers and the fact that they're showing up to do their job every day? Again, outside of what Tom Boasberg has done in Denver, where he's pushed these savings to the school, hardly anybody in the country has done anything like this. Now, in fact, it gets really interesting. If you're familiar with Rocket Ship or New Classrooms, School of One, or Carpe Diem, we've got new school models that because they're hybrid, because they change the teacher role, you could have a teacher absent and you don't need to waste the money on a sub because teachers can just mix differently the way they're working with students that day. So aside from any instructional benefits from hybridization, you're saving $1,000 per teacher that you could put into learning rather than paying a warm body to come up and babysit. Now, as soon as I start talking this way, I will hear all the reasons that this stuff is unworkable and unreasonable. People will tell you, that's interesting, I can't do it. Real simple example, I was working with the Western District last year. Large district, didn't have an apprenticeship program. We were talking about it. The head of student services said, yeah, you know, I would love to introduce an apprenticeship program. It's part of our career readiness track, but we can't afford it. And I said, why can't we afford it? And she said, problem is, state regs require that we have a full-time equivalent on premises. anywhere we've got kids doing an apprenticeship. I said, you sure? She said, it's in the district policy book. I'm like, that's crazy. Why don't we have somebody call the state and ask the SEA if there's some way we can get a workaround? So she did. I was back the next month. We sat down. She said, good news. We're going to be able to do it. I said, they have flexibility? She said, turns out we didn't need it. A decade ago, somebody, either because they were dumb or malicious, transcribed the state regulation as saying you need somebody full-time on premises, when the state regulation actually said you need a full-time employee to regularly visit the premises where kids are doing an apprenticeship. And we called the SEA, and the SEA said, yeah, we figure that's like once a month. That's passable. So all of a sudden, the district went from being prohibited from being able to serve kids for career readiness to no problem, because we had looked at what was and was not mandated. Dirty little secret. More than half the time in my experience, when folks in your schools and systems tell me they can't do things, they actually can do things. What they mean is they have heard they can't, or they picked up the phone and called and said, can I? And somebody said no. And they said rats, and put the phone down and we're done. They didn't ask to say, can you show me where it's prohibited? They didn't ask the state Title I coordinator to show them what prohibited them from reprogramming those funds or reassigning that instructional personnel. And our friend Mike Casserly, as he often says, as I quote in the book, U.S. Constitution, if something's not prohibited by the feds, it's permitted. But we operate in a very different mindset. It's another example. You'll often hear that we can't do something. So the first thing you need is you've got to work with your folks at the state level to start to change their mindset and to proactively change the mindsets of the folks below them. Melissa Young and Shira Kavark, a couple of great consultant attorneys with Federal Ed Group, talk about a state they were working with the other year. State wanted districts to get much more creative about programming Title I. They sent out a memo, they did a webinar, they got back the applications for use of Title I funds end of the year. Nobody had changed. They tried to figure out what went on. They kept hearing two things. One, we don't believe you. We think when we do something different, you're just going to make our lives unpleasant. And two, the state had never changed the drop-down menu. So it still had the 4 categories of permissible use. And people said, well, look, there's nowhere even to do it on the form. Why would we trust that we're going to be able to go ahead and do this? So when you tell folks you want them to feel free to solve problems, what are you doing with your SEAs to put the message out? John White in Louisiana had this problem with his federal grants coordinator. Kept telling her job was to help his parishes solve problems. They kept coming back to John and saying, she tells us what we can't do. After enough of this, he had an easy solution. He fired her. And he brought in somebody else who was going to help make solutions happen. A guy named Scott Mendelsberg in Colorado, runs Gear Up Colorado, had a problem. He's got about 600 kids a couple years ago in Gear Up, be first-generation college goers if they make it, almost all of them non-native English language speakers. Wanted to get them credit for the fact that he thinks it's cool that they can all speak 2 languages. Called up the college, I guess it was a college board, before David took over, said, hey guys, I've got this situation, I'd like to get these kids college credit, what can I do? They said, oh, you're good to go, have them take the AP. He said 2 problems. First problem, these kids are already fluent Spanish speakers, kind of hate to make them sit bored to death for 180 days so they can take a test at the end of the year. 2, most of their schools don't actually offer AP Spanish. College board said, ooh, we're stumped, we're out of ideas. So Scott went up the food chain, talked to an executive vice president. Turns out College Board has this instrument called the CLEP, Collegiate Level Examination Placement, that most of your higher ed systems use. We use it for GIs and college transfers. 45-minute exam. Scott said, can I pay you and administer this? They said, no, nobody's ever done that. He said, well, can we do it? He finally got the go-ahead. Gave these 600 kids this 45-minute exam. 85% of these kids who would be first-generation college goers got 3 to 12 hours of college credit. Done. We know the data on likelihood of matriculating to college if you've actually got college credit already. He had found a way to recognize the skill. He had found a way to solve a significant problem that was getting in the way. Easily, cleanly, other people can replicate, let's move on. So many of the challenges we wrestle with are like that. How do we find a smart way to solve one of the 153 problems that your schools and systems are wrestling with so that we can move on to the next one? Instead of spending ad nauseum the next 4 years talking about how does your legislature come up with lots of new dollars to offer lots of new AP classes, which lots of kids are going to be bored to death sitting through. Now, it's not all about contracts, but contracts are a big piece of this. But it's also the case that contracts are more amorphous than we often hear. Dan Weisberg, who's now, many of you know him, Vice President for Policy at New Teacher Project, has a wonderful anecdote from when he went to New York City to be Joel Klein's director of head of the Teacher Policy Unit. Joel says when he went into New York and he came from outside, remember, Dan came from outside education, Dan kept hearing from principals about their frustration that you needed 5 negative evaluations before you could initiate remediation, before you could initiate removal on a teacher. And New York City's got 80,000 teachers. Odds are some of them probably shouldn't be there for kids. Dan said, gosh, 5, that sounds like a lot. That's what we can do. Looked at the contract. Contract didn't say 5 negative to start. It said 1. So Dan said, where the heck did this 5 come from? He said, I know what it is. It's that darn United Federation of Teachers. It wasn't. It was the general counsel's office at the New York City Department of Education, because it made the lawyer's job easier if they had plenty of paper. And the lawyers had found that when they were going in with 5 evaluations, they seemed to almost always win the grievance and arbitration. So they just made that practice, and nobody read the contract, and this just became the way business was done. So New York City Department of Ed was running its business around the convenience of attorneys rather than the good instructional decisions of principals. And what we do is we scapegoat sometimes, not always. Believe me, those of you who know my work know that I'm very tough on my friends at the unions. But we sometimes scapegoat them because we're letting leaders off the hook. And we do this crazy thing where we let leaders get away with saying, I can't do something even if they can. I'll tell you what. If we went to the University of Missouri and we were watching, fall football practice, and some 19-year-old offensive lineman was out there, and offensive linemen in pass protection are allowed to do this. In fact, it's encouraged because it's better than having closed hands, but you're not allowed to close them and grab the guy. If your 19-year-old college athlete who's making no money doesn't know that rule and is blocking incorrectly, his coach is going to tear his head off. There's no toleration for not knowing the rules of your chosen profession. Yet, I will routinely interact with superintendents and senior central office staff and principals who have no idea what their contract says or doesn't say, who don't actually bother to try to find out what Title I does or doesn't permit, what IDEA does or does not require. I'll tell you what, if I was a coach and that football player came to me and I said, what the heck are you doing? And he said, my buddy told me I'm allowed to do that. I'd say, you're not even allowed to play football for me for free. But we're paying principals and superintendents $100,000, $200,000, and they can't even be bothered to know the rules of their chosen profession. That's not acceptable. Here's one place to start. Next time you hear you can't do something because of the contract, first thing to do is ask whether the contract is legal. For instance, over the years, I've heard from friends in Baltimore and PGC leadership in Maryland that they're frustrated that they couldn't extend their academic year because the union wouldn't agree. Turns out, school year is a subject of prohibited bargaining in Maryland. Districts bargained away language they were statutorily prohibited from bargaining on. All you need as a superintendent is to write a very nice note that says, my general counsel advises me we're in violation. Sorry, can no longer respect that provision, we're going ahead. Yet, time after time, we don't do that. In fact, ask Tony Bennett about his experience in Indiana with this. Tony will tell you that after Mitch Daniels and the legislature did Act 10, which peeled off all of this other stuff from collective bargaining, so it was just wages and wage-related benefits, 3/4 or more of the contracts they got back left in all the language that was now illegal. Because the superintendents didn't want to tick off their union partners or Uniserv, and they just said, well, we'll let it be the state chief's problem. Now, what I am not talking about here, is cage fighting. I'm talking about cage busting. This is Chris Barbick's line from when we did the book launch, and I love it. I wish he'd said it before. I would have used it in the book. In fact, when your leaders know how to cage bust, when they know how to identify which bars of that cage are really there, when they know how to pick the lock, they can actually burn less political capital. Real easy illustration. Adrian Manuel, a couple years ago, about 5 years ago, was asked to take over one of the worst performing middle schools in New York City. One of the bottom 10%. Went in, had to keep largely the same staff, said, look, the only way we're going to change things here is by getting much better at teaching. And that means we got to do professional learning community, a PLC, right. Can't be 45 minutes twice a week. We're going to do it the way Google and 3M do team development. I want my people working in teams and improving 1 full day a week. Now, the problem was, New York City contract stipulates teachers can only teach 3 periods in a row. There was no way to actually give each of his teachers a day off a week in teams and respect the contract. So he called in his union steward, explained the problem he was trying to solve, why he thought his solution made sense, didn't say to his union steward, can I? He said to his union steward, how do we solve this problem? How do we? Union steward said, that's interesting. I'm open to it. Got together 4 teacher leaders. Adrian bought a day of their time. They built a schedule in which teachers were teaching 4 or 5 preps in a row, violation of the contract. Took it to the faculty. Faculty voted for it, something like 95%. And guess what? In New York City, with the famous contract, like in so many of your districts, teachers at a school are free to waive almost any contract provision with a 70 or 75% vote. Problem solved. They went ahead and did it. No complaints. 4 years later, Axion Academy was one of the 10% top performing middle schools in New York City. I don't think it was just the PLC piece, but I think it was that kind of thinking. So it's not that cage busting is about how often you can run into the cage with your head. It's about how do you use the authority that you actually should enjoy to reprogram E-rate funds, to think differently about what's permissible, to make sure you're solving problems for kids. This is a huge problem that we get wrong time after time in 2 huge ways. And we're just about at the end, and then we'll open it up. First way we get it wrong is we waste our ammunition. Many of you guys might remember Stanford Children's big fight in Massachusetts a couple years ago, year and a half ago, to push the referendum issue that wound up helping force Massachusetts to require districts to take teacher performance into account when doing RIFs. Okay, tell you what, there was nothing in Massachusetts that prohibited districts from already taking performance into account. Nothing whatsoever. It was gutless, tepid, irresponsible leadership over the preceding 3 decades in which districts had given away their most fundamental responsibility to negotiate effectively. So the first thing is that cage-busting leadership can help us hold the line and reduce the need to burn up political capital in state houses. Second thing is that our policy victories are much frailer than you might imagine. Common Core, school turnarounds, teacher evaluation depend hugely on what leaders do. In Florida, Senate Bill 736. In Tennessee, teacher evaluation. Millions of dollars implementation. In Florida, they're devising 400 new assessments to do every subject. Tons of coaching, tons of observation, largely because 99% of teachers were once identified as effective. After all this money, time, and heartache, that's all the way down to 98%. It's not just getting the policies right. It's making sure we're training and recruiting and cultivating leaders who can do this. Here's a couple bits of advice. Let me just close this out with actually one very simple story. I started with the Michelle Reese story. Let me close with the Kaya Henderson story. Kaya, a couple years ago, wanted to give her principals a big raise. 2 years ago, wanted to give them $35,000 raise. Went to her administrative bargaining unit, said to them, what do you think? They said, that's great. We also need you to give that same raise to other school business officers, school level administrative staff. And Kaya said, I can't do that. You've got business secretaries, or whatever DC calls them, who've got community college degrees who are making 70 grand. I can't justify giving them a big raise right now. Administrators Union said, sorry. Kaya said, rats. This is at the point where most leaders either just give it up or wind up in a public mud fight. Instead, Kaya went and read her contract. Contract allows the DC chancellor to give a $20,000 retention raise to anybody who's being poached. Kaya said, I got 121 principals who are being poached. And next year, they're all in danger of being poached again, and I'm going to give them their next 15,000, and they'll get their 35 over 2 years. And then, and here's the really interesting thing, this is where it goes from an uphill to a downhill slog. She went back to the union, and she said, you guys have 3 choices. You can sit on your hands and let me take the credit. You can stand at the mic with me and share the credit. Or I can go ahead and give big raises to your members, and you can attack me in the papers for doing so, which is, those of you who are politicians, what we call a win-win battle. So, end of the day, cage busting is not about burning political capital. It's about using all of the tools at our leaders' disposal, and you guys helping put them in a position to do so, so that they can be the most effective instructional leader they can be. Final word, nothing I'm talking about here is about innovation. It's not doing stuff differently. It's identifying important problems for kids and then finding the smarter, better way to solve those problems without regard to a rule that made sense 30 or 40 or 60 years ago. With that, open it up. Questions, pushback, what have you. I hardly ever cry, so feel free. Thank you. I've also been known to kind of pound people into quiet submission, so it's all right. Thanks a lot.